I want to tell you about the morning I learned that gratitude has an expiration date in some families, and that mine had run out 3 years before I noticed. I'd just come out of 6 hours of surgery, a tumor the size of a plum, removed from behind my ribs, and a recovery I was told not to face alone. I called my husband first. Straight to voicemail. My son next. 2 rings, then nothing. I lay there on the hospital bed with the discharge papers in my lap, watching other patients get wheeled out by people who loved them, and I told the nurse I'd manage. I always managed. I called a cab myself. I signed my own release forms. I carried my own bag to the curb. When the driver pulled up to my house, the house with my name on the deed, the house I'd paid for with 22 years of a career nobody in that family ever asked about, there were cars in the driveway I didn't recognize, and music coming from inside like it was somebody's birthday. It wasn't anybody's birthday. I stood on my own porch for almost a full minute before I opened the door, because some part of me already knew that whatever I found inside would rearrange everything I thought I understood about my marriage, my son, and 22 years of showing up for people who had already decided, quietly, without telling me, that I was the one who didn't belong there anymore. I just didn't know yet how wrong they were about what I'd actually built, or how carefully I'd built it. The music was coming from the living room, and underneath it, laughter. The easy, unguarded kind that stops the second a stranger walks in. Except I wasn't a stranger. I was standing in my own doorway with a hospital bracelet still on my wrist, and nobody stopped laughing at all. There were 4 people in my living room. My husband, Richard, sat in his armchair with a drink in his hand, like it was any ordinary Tuesday evening. My son, Ethan, was perched on the arm of the sofa, scrolling his phone, not even looking up. A woman I didn't know, mid-30s, blonde, wearing heels that had never touched gravel in their life, stood by the bay window with a tape measure stretched between her hands, marking something on the wall with a pencil. And Marla, our housekeeper of 9 years, was in the kitchen doorway, holding a tray of appetizers, like she was catering the whole scene. Nobody moved toward me. I set my hospital bag down by the door, the way I set down anything I intend to pick back up later, and I waited. It was Ethan who spoke first, and not to me. He turned to the blonde woman and said, loud enough for the room, "This is the woman who actually cares about how the house looks." Finally, he laughed a little, like he'd made a joke, and the woman laughed with him, soft and pleased, still holding her tape measure against my wall. I felt something in my chest go very still, not shatter, still, the way water goes still right before it freezes. Richard didn't stand. He looked at me over the rim of his glass, the way he might glance at a delivery he wasn't expecting, and he said, "You're back early." Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "How did surgery go?" Not, "Who drove you?" I told him no one drove me. I told him I'd called a cab from the hospital bed because no one answered the phone. I kept my voice even, the way I'd learned to keep it even over 22 years of dinners, where my opinion arrived after everyone else's had already been decided. Richard set his glass down on the side table, my side table, the one I'd found at an estate sale the year Ethan started high school, and he said the words I will remember for the rest of my life, delivered as casually as a weather report. "We should probably talk about timing, for when you're planning on moving out." The room didn't go quiet. That's the strange thing I remember most. The music kept playing, low and pleasant, some acoustic song meant for exactly this kind of afternoon, curtains and appetizers, and a woman in heels measuring my walls for a life that apparently no longer had room for me in it. I looked at the blonde woman. She had stopped smiling, but she hadn't stopped measuring. I looked at Marla, who wouldn't meet my eyes, which told me she'd known before I walked in, known and said nothing, and I filed that away too, quietly, the way I filed everything. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't cry, I didn't ask who she was, though some old, foolish part of me already knew the answer, and had known it, I think, for longer than I wanted to admit. I picked my hospital bag back up off the floor, not because I was leaving, but because I needed my hands to be doing something other than trembling, and I asked one question into that too-pleasant room, in a voice that surprised even me with how calm it was. "Has anyone here actually checked whose name is on the deed to this house?" Nobody answered right away. Richard's jaw tightened. Ethan finally looked up from his phone, and the woman by the window lowered her tape measure, just an inch, just enough that I noticed her eyes go from me to Richard and back again, searching his face for an answer he clearly hadn't given her either. I smiled. Not for them. For myself. Because for the first time in years, I understood exactly what I was standing on, and none of them had any idea what that meant yet. Silence has a texture when you've spent long enough in a marriage learning to read it. This one was thin and brittle, stretched over 4 people who had clearly rehearsed a version of this afternoon that did not include me asking about paperwork. Richard recovered first, the way he always did, not with an answer, but with a redirection. "This isn't the time," he said, glancing toward the woman by the window, as if her presence in my living room was somehow my failure of timing, not his. "You just got out of surgery. You're not thinking clearly. I have never, in 22 years, been anything but clear. That was always the problem, I think. I noticed things. I noticed the business trips that started requiring an extra night. I noticed the new perfume in the laundry that wasn't mine. I noticed the way Richard had started calling his phone work, even on Saturdays. I noticed and I said nothing, because I had built a life around the belief that patience was a virtue, and that our family was worth protecting, even from itself. I set my bag down again, deliberately this time, and I asked the woman her name. She hesitated, glancing at Richard the way you'd glance at someone before answering a question in a meeting you weren't sure you were allowed to speak in. "Diane," she said finally. "Diane," I repeated, and I let the name settle into the room like a stone dropped into still water. "How long has this been going on?" Nobody answered that either. Ethan shifted on the arm of the sofa, and for a moment, just a moment, I saw something flicker across his face that might have been shame, quickly smoothed over by irritation, the easier emotion, the one that let him blame me for making things awkward, instead of asking why his father had a woman measuring curtains in his mother's house. "Mom," he said, "can we not do this right now? It's been a really nice afternoon." A really nice afternoon. I turned that phrase over in my mind while I looked at my son, 24 years old, raised in this house, educated because of the job I'd worked while Richard chased ventures that rarely paid off. And I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that whatever had happened in this house while I was recovering from surgery had been happening for a long time before that, in smaller ways, in ways I had let myself not see. I didn't argue with him. I didn't remind him whose tuition check cleared 4 separate times. I simply nodded, once, and walked past all of them toward the hallway that led to my study, the small room off the kitchen that Richard had always called your filing cabinet with a door, said with the particular fondness people reserve for things they've decided don't matter. Marla caught my arm gently as I passed the kitchen, her tray still balanced on one hip. "Eleanor," she whispered, low enough that the others couldn't hear over the music. "I didn't know how to tell you. She's been coming around for months. I thought you knew." I hadn't known, not the specifics, but I had felt the shape of something wrong for a long time, the way you feel a draft before you find the open window. I thanked her, quietly, and continued down the hall. My study door was closed, the way I'd left it 3 weeks ago before my pre-op appointments began consuming every hour of my life. I turned the handle and stepped inside, and that was when I noticed it. Small, easy to miss if you didn't know exactly where everything belonged. The bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, the one that held the property documents, the original deed, the trust paperwork my late father's attorney had drawn up 11 years ago when he'd insisted, over my objections, that the house be placed solely in my name, that drawer was unlocked. I always locked it. I had locked it the morning I left for the hospital, the way I locked it every single day for 11 years. I stood there for a long moment, my hand still on the drawer, my heart beating steady and slow, and I understood that whatever I found inside that folder was not going to be the same as what I'd left there. I pulled the drawer open slowly, the way you open something when part of you already suspects the news inside will not be good, and I found the folder exactly where it should have been, the manila edges worn soft from 11 years of handling, but the papers inside were not in the order I had left them. My father had been a careful man, a man who distrusted verbal promises and believed that love, properly expressed, came with documentation. When he died, he'd left me more than grief. He'd left me the house, not Richard and me, not the family, But me, Eleanor, by name, in a trust that even a divorce could not easily unravel. Richard had fought him on it once, gently, at a dinner years ago, suggesting it might be simpler to have both their names on everything. My father had looked at him with the polite, immovable expression he reserved for people he'd already decided he didn't trust, and said that simplicity wasn't always in a woman's best interest. I hadn't understood, at the time, how right he'd been. What I found in the folder now was a photocopy, not the original, which was still there, still legally mine, untouched and unbreakable, but a photocopy with handwriting in the margins that wasn't mine. Richard's handwriting, small calculations, a phone number I didn't recognize, circled twice, and beside it, in his cramped, familiar script, 3 words that stopped my breath in my chest. Ask about refinancing. I sat down slowly in the desk chair, the folder open in my lap, and I let myself understand what I was looking at. Richard had been searching for a way around my father's trust, not asking me, not including me. Searching, quietly, the way a man searches when he already knows the answer will be no, and wants to find it out through a side door instead. I thought about the business trips. I thought about Diane's tape measure against my living room wall, marking a life she clearly believed was already half hers. I thought about my son calling her the woman who actually cares, as though care was a performance, and I had simply failed to attend enough rehearsals. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect tears at a moment like this, and I didn't have any to give it. What I felt instead was quieter and colder, and, in its own way, more useful, a kind of clarity settling into my bones like frost on a window, sharp-edged and clear enough to see straight through. I closed the folder. I did not confront Richard that night. I want to be honest about that too, because the version of me that existed before that afternoon might have marched back into the living room and demanded answers, might have raised her voice, might have given them all the satisfaction of watching her come undone in front of a woman measuring curtains for a house that would never, under any circumstance, belong to her. That was not who I was going to be. Not that night. Not ever again, if I could help it. Instead, I picked up my phone and called the one person who had never, in 22 years, given me a single reason to doubt him, my father's attorney, a woman now in her 60s named Carol Whitfield, who had drafted the trust in the first place and had told me, more than once over the years, only half joking, that if anything ever felt wrong in that house, I should call her before I called anyone else. She answered on the second ring, the way people do when they've spent a career being the person others call in a crisis. "Eleanor," she said, warmth immediate in her voice. "How was the surgery?" "I need you to look at something," I said, and I told her about the drawer, the photocopy, the handwriting in the margins. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the particular silence of someone recalculating. "Eleanor," she said finally, her voice different now, careful in a way I'd never heard from her before. "There's something about your father's trust I should have told you years ago. He asked me not to, until it mattered. I think it matters now." I sat very still in my study, the folder closed in my lap, the party still murmuring faintly down the hall, and I asked her what she meant. Carol asked if I could talk freely, and I told her I was alone in my study with the door closed, which was as close to freely as anything in that house allowed anymore. She exhaled slowly, the sound of someone about to hand over something they'd been carrying a long time. "Your father didn't just leave you the house," she said. "He left you controlling interest in Hargrove Fabrications, 31%. It's been sitting in a secondary trust since his death, structured so it wouldn't trigger estate complications while you were still working full-time. He didn't want it interfering with your career, or with Richard's ego, his words, not mine. The trust matures automatically on the 10th anniversary of his passing, converts from a holding trust into a direct asset in your name. Eleanor, that anniversary was 6 weeks ago." I sat with that for a moment, turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what's living underneath it. Hargrove Fabrications was not some small operation. It was the mid-sized manufacturing company Richard's own firm had subcontracted with for the better part of a decade. The account, I now realized with a slow, sinking clarity, that Richard talked about constantly at dinner parties, as though it were his own crowning achievement, the client relationship he was proudest of maintaining. "Does Richard know?" I asked, though some part of me already understood the answer before Carol spoke it. Not from me, she said. But Eleanor, I sent the standard maturation notice to the address on file 6 weeks ago. Your home address. I thought of the mail. I thought of Richard, who collected it every afternoon without fail, an old habit I'd never questioned because it had always seemed like a small, thoughtful thing a husband did. I thought of how conveniently that habit positioned him between me and anything my father's attorneys might send. He would have needed to open something addressed to you, I said slowly. He would have needed to open something addressed to you, Carol agreed, and I could hear, even through the phone, that she understood exactly what that meant for a marriage. Neither of us was pretending anymore was healthy. I asked her what it meant, practically. 31%. A controlling position. She explained it plainly. The way she'd explained things to me since I was a grieving 34-year-old signing paperwork I barely had the heart to read. 31%, combined with the 2 other minority trusts my father had quietly negotiated with old business partners over the years, men who'd trusted him enough to let their own children's inheritances be tied to mine, gave me effective control of the company's board decisions. Not majority ownership outright. Something better. Alliance. My father had spent the last years of his life building me a net I hadn't known existed, one he clearly hoped I would never need. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked, and I didn't mean it as an accusation. I meant it as the question of a woman trying to understand how much of her own life had been happening without her. Because he asked me not to, until it mattered, Carol said again, gently this time. He said, and I remember this exactly, that you'd know when it mattered, because you'd stop asking permission to be angry. I closed my eyes. Down the hall, faintly, I could hear the party still going, Diane's laugh threading through the music, Ethan's voice saying something I couldn't make out, Richard's low murmur beneath it all, a man entirely certain of his footing in a house he no longer understood. I told Carol I needed copies of everything, the original trust, the maturation notice, proof of the mailing date, sent to my personal email by morning, not the shared account Richard and I had used for 15 years, an account I now understood he almost certainly still had access to. There's one more thing, Carol said, just as I was about to thank her and hang up. The notice I sent included a request for updated contact preferences, standard procedure at maturation. Someone submitted a response 3 weeks ago, changing the primary point of contact for all future Hargrove Fabrications correspondence. My hand tightened around the phone. Changed it to who? Carol paused, and in that pause I heard the particular hesitation of a woman about to hand someone a piece of information she knew would change everything. To Richard, she said. He signed it as your authorized representative. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the guest room, because the master bedroom no longer felt like mine to walk into without knowing exactly what I might find, and I let the anger arrive at last, quietly, on its own schedule, the way a tide comes in when no one is watching the shore. Richard had forged my signature. Not clumsily, Carol confirmed, once the documents arrived the next morning, that whoever prepared the authorization form had studied my handwriting closely enough to make it convincing to anyone who wasn't looking for the small, deliberate imperfections I'd carried in my signature since a childhood injury to my right hand. But Carol had been looking. She'd flagged it before I even asked her to. I spent the next 11 days doing something I had never done in 22 years of marriage. I stopped narrating my life out loud to the people living inside it. I met with Carol twice, in her office, never at the house. I met with a forensic document examiner she trusted, who confirmed in writing what we already knew. I met, quietly, with 2 of the men whose family trusts sat alongside mine in the Hargrove Alliance, old friends of my father's, both of whom remembered me as a girl, and both of whom, it turned out, had been growing uneasy for over a year about certain irregularities in how the account Richard's firm managed had been billing the company. Irregularities I now had both the standing and the documentation to formally request an audit on. I did not tell Richard any of this. I let him believe the silence in our house was grief, or shock, or the quiet defeat he'd clearly been expecting from me since the day I found him with a drink in his hand and a woman measuring my walls. I served him coffee some mornings. I asked Ethan, once, mildly, how his classes were going, and watched him mistake my composure for forgiveness. On the 12th day, I asked Richard to sit down at the kitchen table, and I told him I wanted to discuss the house. He looked almost relieved, the particular relief of a man who believes the difficult conversation is finally going to go his way. He started talking about timelines, about being reasonable, about how Diane had actually been wonderful throughout all of this, how mature it would be if I could simply see that our marriage had quietly ended long before that afternoon, and everyone would be happier moving forward honestly. I let him finish. Then I placed 3 folders on the table between us, one at a time, the way you lay down cards you've been holding since long before the other player realized the game had changed. The first held the original trust documents, the deed, my father's signature notarized 11 years ago, untouched by anything Richard had hoped to find in that unlocked drawer. The second held the forensic handwriting analysis, my forged signature next to my real one, the differences circled in red by a professional whose findings would hold up anywhere Richard might try to take this. The third held the Hargrove Fabrications maturation notice, the fraudulent contact change, and a letter, signed by myself and the 2 allied trust holders, formally requesting a financial audit of every account Richard's firm had managed for that company over the past 4 years. I watched the color drain slowly from his face as he read, page by page, the exact shape of what he had done, and how completely I now understood it. "You have 2 options," I told him, my voice as calm as it had been that first afternoon in the living room, because I had promised myself I would never again let this family see me shake. "You can cooperate fully with the audit and the amended paperwork correcting your fraudulent authorization, and we handle the rest of this quietly, through my attorney, like adults, or I let the board see everything I've just shown you, and you can explain to Hargrove Fabrications, to your own firm, and eventually to whoever prosecutes forgery in this state, exactly why you thought no one would check." He didn't move toward voicemail this time. He didn't ask me to be reasonable. He sat very still, the way I once had, in a house that no longer belonged to the version of him standing in it. Diane left before the end of that week, once she understood the curtains she'd been measuring for would never be hers to hang. Ethan came to me eventually, weeks later, not with an apology exactly, but with the beginning of one, and I let him find his way toward the rest of it slowly, the way people do when they're finally ready to see clearly. I kept the house. I kept my name on everything that had always, quietly, belonged to me. And I learned, in the end, that the people who underestimate a patient woman are usually the ones who taught her, without meaning to, exactly how patient she could be. If this story moved you, stay a while longer. There are more women like Eleanor, waiting to tell you what happened when everyone assumed they'd stay silent. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.